Welcome to View from the North on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today, we'll talk about Trump's 25% tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico. How will these tariffs affect trade with Canada and Mexico? Our guest for the show is Dr. Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. This is an interesting subject because it's alive and well. I mean, Trump is in office, announced his pick of the Michigan GOP chair, former U.S. Representative Pete Hoekstra, as the new U.S. ambassador to Canada. Trump is very proud of Hoekstra because he was a big factor in the election in the state of Michigan. And Hoekstra will take office as ambassador right after Trump is inaugurated on January 20th. And that'll be a change. One of the things about Hoekstra is that he is going to support Trump's change of trade policy with Canada. And that's of some concern because Trump's change of trade policy with Canada is troubling. Trump met with Justin Trudeau a week or two ago at Mar-a-Lago, and they talked about Trump's concerns over trade with Canada. And he said that he was going to impose 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico unless Canada and Mexico respected his demands. He told Trudeau that he was very concerned that 70 countries had supplied migrants who crossed the northern border, that fentanyl was coming in through the northern border, and that there was $100 billion trade deficit between the U.S. and Canada. Unless these problems were resolved, Trump was going to impose that tariff on the 25% tariff on Canada. So let's talk first about what that tariff would mean. Do you have any idea? Because Justin Trudeau was very concerned about that. Would you be concerned about that?
My way to describe it is very uncivil. It makes the United States out to be a international joke. That is, the United States has an agreement with Canada and Mexico. It used to be called NAFTA. It's now got a funny name. However, basically a trade agreement. And to simply start in the middle and just say we're going to rip that up and put on a 25% tariff. Well, let's put that in perspective. And I'll use the phrase in advance that it is a tactic that is worse than an average gangster. Trump's approach is absolutely ludicrous in terms of any common sense, any normal international fair play, any normal rules of any sort. So first of all, Canada is not unique compared to most advanced countries in the world, in which it has approximately a third of, or at least the size of the exports that Canada has equal approximately 1/3 of its gross domestic product. Now, Canada's imports and exports are roughly in balance. That is, Canada has a very minor negative balance of trade, but it's pretty close to in balance. The United States is not in balance, but that doesn't necessarily arise that it's Canada's fault that the US is not in balance. Now, the balance between Canada and the United States is in Canada's favor, but it's not in Canada's favor vis-a-vis the whole world in terms of trade. But about 3/4 of the trade Canada does is with the United States. The US is fairly unique in in terms of an advanced country as respect to having a smaller percentage of its gross national product connects to international trade. That is, Americans might think that they do lots of trade. They do lots in volume. But relative to the US economy, it's way less than half the size as it is in Canada. And you have countries in Europe like the Netherlands where the dollar value of exports is equal to about 3/4 of the GDP. They import the same, where France and the United Kingdom and Canada are about the same, with about the 1/3 of their GDP is equal to the size of each of their exports and imports. When Donald Trump simply comes out and says, on day one, without any explanation whatsoever, I'm going to slap a 25% tariff on all imports coming from Canada and Mexico into the United States, unless you somehow immediately eliminate the flow of immigrants coming across the border into the United States, and secondly, fentanyl. Well, is it Canada's fault that Americans demand so much fentanyl that people are anxious to try to smuggle it into the United States? Now, there's Canadian-US border happens to be about 5,000 miles long. Is it suddenly Canada's fault? That the flow of people and drugs from Canada in the US is really, really tiny compared to the flow from Mexico. It's almost insignificant. Um, so, to suddenly take the whole Canadian economy and hold them to ransom for an unrealistic demand, is just straight gangsterism, and it's absurd. Now, who in their right mind would ever trust the Americans again? Why should anybody in the world have any respect whatsoever for any agreement that the United States would make? Because this is a blatant breaking of the most basic agreements, really a cornerstone to Canada's well-being. And he just doesn't care.
No, and he is arrogant beyond description. And he is a bully, just as he was in school, in the playground, during lunch. He's just pushing Canada around. He's pushing Mexico around. He's pushing a lot of countries around with his threats over these huge tariffs immediately. And I suggest to you there's more to come. This arrogance involves a lot of issues. The tariffs is only one expression of his arrogance. And by the way, Ken, for him to meet with the leader of another country is against the law. It's against the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution, and more specifically against the Logan Act. It's a felony for him as a non-official to meet with and negotiate with leaders of foreign countries. It's amazing how he is either uninformed or doesn't care. Probably doesn't care. The other thing I wanted to mention is these demands he's making. Let's assume that Justin Trudeau would really like to do this. So how does he do it? I think you pointed this out. It's a 5,000-mile border. How do you stop migrants from coming over it? You have to have cooperation on both sides. And, the US should be at least a partner in this. Maybe it's the principal partner in stopping migrants. Trump claimed that the migrants were coming from 70 countries. I think that's just one of his lies. He doesn't have any evidence of that. Nobody knows of that. And yet there he goes. And people ostensibly believe him when he says that. But let's talk about the migrants. What could Canada do if it took him seriously about that problem he describes and that threat? What could it do?
Nothing. Not really. I mean, as a practical matter, you cannot suddenly have drones and helicopters and people 24 hours a day flying along the border trying to check, is there anything happening. There's not tunnels and that kind of thing like there is across the Mexican border, and but really, the flow of drugs. Um, it's really when, an 18-wheeler rolls up between Canada and the United States, and if it has drugs in it, who's supposed to be checking, that truck that's going in? Is Canada supposed to have checked the truck before it left and then the US check it again? Normally, it's the country into which something is going that has the methods by which you check, and the other country cooperates in that regard. But the flow of 18 wheelers, coming across either the Canadian border into the US or the Mexican border into the US. I mean, the trucks go both ways, and, Canada has a problem with guns coming from the United States. Is the United States responsible for guns being smuggled into Canada? Where they're illegal to have them in Canada.
I take your point, Ken. One would assume that the country that wants to keep people or drugs or guns out, that country should be examining every vehicle. And so, if there's a failure here, either on people or drugs or guns entering the United States, the fault, the failure is the United States. It just seems completely unreasonable and irrational for Trump to say it's Canada's problem. No, it's not. It's the US's problem. He's trying to put the blame on someone else. That's what he's trying to do. But I think the juiciest thing here, at least for me, as an observer of trade and economics, is when Trump says that Canada is, and I'm quoting, ripping off, end quote, the US for $100 billion. He refers to the trade deficit. But exactly how do you fix a trade deficit? How do you change the numbers? What do you do? Stand on the street corner in Toronto and say, do not buy American goods? Do you check the trucks coming into Canada and the aircraft coming into Canada to limit the importation of American goods? Is that how you fix the trade deficit? That all seems quite absurd to me. Is there any way that you could adjust the trade deficit of trade into Canada to, what do you want to call it, equalize the trade deficits on both sides? Is there any way you could do that?
Well, you can, but some of the problems that the U.S. has with its balance of trade is of its own making in many regards. Um, the U.S. Has the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency, and because of that, the U.S. dollar is always a little bit overpriced. That is, um, the US has a slight disadvantage in trading with absolutely everybody in the world as long as the dollar is valued by everybody at a teeny bit more than it should be. That teeny bit is a disadvantage. Now, the US gets lots of other compensating advantages over having the US dollar as a reserve currency. For example, the US can run ridiculous government deficits year after year after year, and it has done so. And that's because there's always enough demand for the dollar that they don't have to have the same discipline that every other country has. Um, Now, the balance of trade that Canada has in total with everybody is Canada has a slight trade deficit, but it's really, really close to being in balance. Um, Now, if you take only the trade of goods, that's quite different because the United States has a fairly big advantage in things like, let's say, vis-a-vis Canada, there's a whole bunch of franchises. If you want to go to a Kentucky Fried Chicken joint in Toronto or Calgary or Vancouver in Canada, it's the same Kentucky Fried Chicken. The recipe is the same, the protection's the same, but every one of those little Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises are sending money to Colonel Sanders or whoever is now the owner of the original Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise. And similarly, you have all the movies, the royalties. There's a whole bunch of intangible trade items that go in the U.S. favor. So it's a little unfair to say we only want to count the balance of trade in goods. We should include goods and services and financial dealings as well. But the other countries in the world, when you add all the countries together, everybody's trade balances. But some countries seem to always run at a surplus. Germany does fairly significantly. Switzerland always does. China does. Now, the United States can say, and I think not unreasonably when it comes to China, they cheat. That is, they will subsidize something like the electric vehicles in order to get such a big market share that then they can raise the price later. But that's the same kind of tactic that all American corporations use, and why the American economy does not work as efficiently as an academic economist says it should and ought to. That the government's role in the United States is not adequate. You don't, the average American corporation takes great pride in and talks about what a wonderful moat they can establish. That is MOAT, much like an old castle, that used to have the water around so nobody could storm the castle. Well, American corporations build moats around their uh, market power, or their ability to get a better price for their product than free enterprise would permit. That they have really, really clever ways good corporations will have, and that term moat is so common. Anybody that deals with the purchase of common stocks would probably deal with that or understand that term as being a wonderful thing for a company that they want to buy. And so you have that type of thing is affected not just by a company but also by countries. Some of the countries that have cleverly devised um, things that they do or do not do that you know bend the rules a little bit in their favor. But the international rules are it's the lack of having the proper rules and international governance, not unlike in the United States. You have extremely poor uh, government role in terms of controlling the unfair competition of corporations. That is, in Canada, it's much tougher for a corporation to have a monopoly or an oligopoly and abuse it. That we still have a lot, but not as bad as the U.S.
Trump said that Canada was, quote, ripping off the US for $100 billion. Is there any reality to that number, or did you just pull that out of a dark place? Does that sound right to you? Or is that a legitimate number? Because we don't necessarily believe anything that Trump says.
The trade every day is about 3.8 billion. So if you go for 365 days, you can get quite an amount, but 100 billion deficit in the trade is absolute lunacy. Is not anything like that. Um, and most of the trade between Canada and the United States is a little different than a lot of the other trade. To some extent, Canada will send wheat across the border, and then the United States will make some cereal out of it and sell the cereal back to Canada. Like an awful lot of it is the raw material going, like whether it's lumber, agricultural products, you name it, going into the US and a manufactured good coming back. You'd say that's kind of unfair. To use the muscle to say no, we want everything that's to be manufactured and the valuable stuff to happen on the U.S. side of the border. However, you can take many other parts of the trade, or the sophistication of what's being manufactured in Canada is of the same league as in the U.S. However, to say there's $100 billion trade deficit is absolute lunacy. Canada does
Go
have
ahead.
trouble running a positive balance of trade, in world total. Now it has a bit positive vis-a-vis the U.S., but negative with Europe. But to put it in perspective, um, the United States buys more from Canada than it does from Japan, uh, France, the United Kingdom, and I forgot there was a fourth country, the same league, all combined. That is, it was China, Japan, the United Kingdom, and France. All four of those countries, the United States buys more from them, and Canada buys roughly the same amount from the U.S.
So, Ken, what I'm getting is a kind of parallel analysis here, just like migrants and drugs and guns. mm, If the US wanted to reduce the trade deficit, it could do that. It could take steps to avoid the moat, so to speak, to reorganize the way these corporations operate cross border. And the burden then would seem to me is, as with migrants and drugs and guns, the burden, it seems to me, is on the United States. The burden is on the United States to fix the trade deficit. Am I right?
Uh, the majority of it should be. For example, uh, the majority of the trade with the United States from, say, Mexico is really U.S. corporations that have set up in Mexico, selling their goods to the U.S. and tweaking the price a little bit. If the corporation just adjusts the price a little bit, suddenly the U.S. has a deficit. Each corporation doesn't care. The U.S. does not police that. They do not police the cheating of their own corporations. They might accuse China of cheating, and it's kind of somewhat absurd to accuse Canada of cheating. Well, an awful lot of the corporations that are selling something from Canada to the US are US corporations. I mean, General Motors and Ford have operations in southern Ontario, and stuff goes back and forth across the border all the time. And the US and Canada, to a great extent, hold their hand across their heart and say, oh, we trust all these corporations. They won't do any fuddle duddling of the numbers.
What I get here is that these concerns that Trump expressed in the meeting at Mar-a-Lago were really based on ignorance, bad data, and lies. And they are, none of them are legitimate concerns. That's what I get. On the other hand, that put Trudeau On the other hand, that put Justin Trudeau back on his heels. And he said, wait a minute, if you impose, we can't do that, he said. If you impose a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, that's going to wreck the Canadian economy. So I ask you, as an economist, I ask you, is that true? Would that happen? If assuming that Canada could not fix any of these hypothetical problems, these false problems, if you will, and Trump then slapped a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, and Justin Trudeau says, no, that would wreck the economy of Canada. Would it? What effect would it have on the economy of Canada?
Well, it would certainly set it back. I mean, it would, in most people's definition, would wreck the economy very unfairly. But Trump doesn't care. Is the purpose of, you could do whatever you want with Canada. You cannot fix the United States trade deficit. The deficit the US has is really, with much of the rest of the world. You've got countries like Switzerland and Germany that are just brilliant at devising methods by which they can maintain a trade surplus. Um, and that helps their economy. That's why the Switzerland's standard of living is considerably higher than that of the United States. Much of Europe has moved that way, but some countries like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they have done it in a pretty fair way. The Netherlands is perhaps the best example because they have a bigger scale of trade. Their international trade is more than 3/4 of their GDP. That is, 3/4 of what they produce is sold in some other country, and 3/4 of what they buy is bought from other countries. Um, they're really good at it. But the U.S. does not, seem to care about what's good for their overall economy. All of the changes that Trump is doing, a lot of this like supply management thinking is really to the net result of that will be to increase the uh, differential between the wealthy and the poor. The total economy of the United States is growing, and for the last couple of years is to some extent the envy of the world, but it's not as well as the U.S. should be doing or could be doing. And key is because the whole structure is designed that whatever the wealthy can do to increase uh, the economy in their favor, so they can make more money, does not help the rest of the economy. The spread or the differential between the top 1% and the bottom 50% it just gets bigger every day, and it's such a waste of economic possibility. And as far as I can see, the Trump strategies are simply going to make that worse. You're going to have 4 years of going backwards.
Let's suppose that somehow this hypothetical and probably false number, $100 billion quote ripoff end quote by Canada against the United States is fixed, and we reach a kind of parity, a kind of balance in terms of the trade deficit with Canada. Does does that help the United States? Does it help any particular groups in the United States? What's the net effect of reaching parity, reaching a balance with Canada to the United States?
Well, it doesn't mean anything if it's not with the whole world. That is, the United States has a far bigger deficit with China than it has with Canada. And even though the trade with Canada is much larger than, let's say China, the United Kingdom, France, and Britain all combined, the trade with Canada is about equal to them all. So of course, anything to do with Canada might have a larger number, but as a percentage or as a portion of the trade, and what is the trade? For example, about 25% of the refineries in the United States that generate gasoline get their oil from Western Canada. Now, none of those refineries are sitting in Philadelphia or along the coast in Florida or along the coast in California. Most all of them are in the Midwest. And that's the only oil that they get, or it's virtually all the oil, it's most of it. So suddenly, if you put a 25% tariff on Canadian everything, even though the oil comes in a pipeline, and I don't think anybody's putting their fentanyl in an oil pipeline, or illegal immigrants either. They'd have a little trouble in a pipeline. However, so the oil moves without, how do you inspect it? You know, or whatever. If somebody was putting bags of fentanyl that somehow could be flowed in the pipeline and somebody could take it out in the other end, I suppose that's a possibility, but highly unlikely. I don't see that Exxon is going to put it in their pipeline in Canada and take it out of their pipeline in the U.S. Even though they will call it Imperial Oil in Canada, it's still a subsidiary of Exxon. So, however, uh, the it's just not realistic to blame Canada for the United States having a trade deficit.
He blamed Canada, and he must have really shook Justin Trudeau up. Justin Trudeau responded in this meeting in Mar-a-Lago by saying that that's going to have a terrible effect on the Canadian economy. And in response to that, and this is another area I would like to cover with you, Trump said, well, we'll just make Canada the 51st state. And what does that say to the people of Canada? That Trump would make or want to make Canada the 51st state.
I use the term gangster. That's just a gangsterism type comment. Many a serious word is said in jest.
He went further. He said, don't worry, Justin. We will make you the governor of that state. And I understand, he said, that you have liberals and conservatives who don't necessarily agree. So we can make two states, and you can be the governor of one, say the liberal state. And then you guys will get another governor and make him the governor or her the governor of the conservative state. Now, it all seems absurd, but, it strikes me that an average Canadian would say, what in the world is he talking about? This is like buying Greenland, and then, you have the whole political consideration of Justin Trudeau, who may not be all that popular. He may be gone anyway. And so, he may lose his job in Canada. So where does it all fit when you talk to a head of state in violation of the Logan Act, and you tell him that you want to make Canada the 51st state, and you tell him he can be a governor? It's this kind of a huge disrespect, isn't it? And the people of Canada, they wouldn't react with any great warmth or appreciation to Trump's remarks. How did this sort of thing affect the relationship of the two countries?
I don't think Trump cares one iota, and he will, throw out outlandish statements to see what happens. What is the reaction? I'm sure that he's loving the reactions to his 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, and can keep track of what's everybody say and think, and out of all the things that are said and thought about, he'll say, gee, there's a good idea. I could use that and some other idea. And as a rabble rouser and I'd call it a shit disturber. Um, and but with no good intent, really. I mean, his intent may be, to get, gain popularity in the United States, but also a very major component, as we see it from Canada looking at him, is something that just pacifies his ego.
And that raises the question of whether Trudeau had whether it was a good idea for Trudeau to fly down to Mar-a-Lago and meet with Trump in the first place, and whether Trudeau has whatever it is, the force of personality to deal with a guy like Trump, who is a bully, pushing him around and making these outrageous statements, or whether Trudeau should have just, let Trump do what he wants to do, and ignore this invitation. I guess it was an invitation by Trump to Trudeau, but I don't think just me looking north. I don't think this helps Trudeau in terms of um, his image among the Canadian electorate. What do you think?
Well, they tried to control the press release, but was he there to kiss the ring? Like kiss the Pope's ring attitude? Certainly that's the way Trump would respond. Like it was, you know, flattering to his ego. And maybe that might make sense if you just say what you're posing is unreasonable. What would you really want? If you could get that kind of answer from him, maybe the visit was meaningful. But Trudeau is not popular in Canada. He was elected prime minister with only 1/3 of the popular vote. The only reason it was there was because we have a minority government, or it takes more than, like, we have more than two parties in Canada, and so that they get together in a coalition to form the government. But Trudeau is certainly on his way out. If you look at any polls, he's less popular now than he was when he got 1/3 of the vote.
Here we are when Trudeau may get pushed out, will get pushed out ultimately. And Trump is setting these ridiculous demands and making these ridiculous threats. And I imagine that in the election of the next prime minister, these things must be platform points. They must be in the political conversation around that election. And the question is, what is a good position for Trudeau's successor to take in dealing with these demands and threats and Trump? What do you think?
Well, first of all, Trudeau's party is not quite as far to the left as Bernie Sanders, but getting pretty close. Okay, so they're not on the same wavelength whatsoever as Trump. Okay, the main opposition party in Canada, called the Conservatives, and they used to be called Progressive Conservative. They took the progressive out of it. They're, but not as far to the right as Trump. And they have a whole bunch of policies that Canada has that they support, that are, not something that the United States is willing to support at all. For example, the United States under Trump will probably try to eliminate Obamacare and all kinds of public health. The public health in Canada, everybody considers that's pretty sacred. Not even the Conservatives would even dream of reducing it or ending it. However, most likely when there is another election in Canada, and that one is not due for, ours are not at fixed dates, where yours are at a fixed date. Ours, they have to have one every 5 years, but one can occur in between if the Parliament decides to vote against the government and insist that there be an election. In Canada, we're going to have very anti Trump feelings, very anti American compared to last week. Generally, most Canadians think that they're very similar to individual Americans, but you tend to be astonished at how Americans collectively can do something politically that's very different than Canadians would do collectively. Canadians are far more for the common good. The Americans appear to be for me and to heck with the rest of you.
Well, this is going to change if it hasn't already changed the essential nature of the relationship, I suggest. Dr. Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman, thank you so much for your thoughts on these questions, Ken. I look forward to our next discussion. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Thanks to our viewers for watching. Aloha.